the beginning of the 21st century, humanity was given the greatest promise in its entire history: access. The internet, this boundless ocean of information, was supposed to be the great equalizer. It was meant to democratize knowledge, enlighten the masses, eradicate ignorance, and usher us into a new golden age of rationality. For the first time, every person on the planet could reach scientific papers, philosophical treatises, and historical archives that were once the privilege of the few, locked away in university ivory towers. And what happened instead? Instead of a golden age, we got an unprecedented level of disagreement. We did not become a unified, enlightened collective mind. We became a cacophony, a world where every voice screams its own version of the truth. We now face one of the most profound paradoxes of modernity. Never in history have we had more facts at our fingertips. Yet never have we been further from a shared understanding of truth. Our crisis is not a crisis of information. It is a crisis of trust in those who are allowed to interpret it. Consider a scene that plays out every single day. Someone who spent 15 minutes on a search engine or watched a few YouTube videos confidently argues against the conclusions of a scientist who spent 15 years on laboratory research, peer review, and teaching. This is not simply ignorance debating expertise. It is the collision of two radically different epistemic systems, two completely different ways of knowing the world. In one system, knowledge is hierarchical. It is earned through years of apprenticeship, scrutiny, and recognition. In the other, knowledge is democratic, and anyone with a keyboard believes themselves equal to an authority. This shift lies at the heart of what we now call epistemic anarchy. Epistemic refers to the nature of knowledge. Anarchy refers to the absence of rules. We live in an era with no commonly accepted hierarchy of knowledge, no shared framework for determining what is true, and no consensus on whose voice carries weight. Experts, institutions, scientific journals, all have been demoted to the level of just another opinion in an endless content feed. The consequences are catastrophic. When facts become matters of opinion and competence becomes a matter of personal preference, we lose the shared foundation necessary for society to function. We can no longer agree on basic medical, climate, or economic realities because we cannot agree on whom to trust. This creates the perfect breeding ground for manipulation, falsehood, and collective irrationality. In this video, we will uncover how this collapse happened. We will begin with how the democratization of information became a trap, creating the illusion of understanding. Then we will dive into the psychology of false confidence and the famous Dunning-Kruger effect. Finally, we will examine why institutions lost their anchoring power and how to fill this vacuum not with pseudo-experts but with epistemic humility. Our goal is not to return to a past where knowledge was a privilege, but to restore respect for the process of knowing. That is the only path back to a shared understanding of reality. To understand the depth of our current anarchy, we have to mentally return to a time when knowledge was a scarce resource. Before the digital age, access to specialized information was strictly hierarchical. If you wanted to understand quantum physics, medieval history, or virology, you needed access to university libraries, peer-reviewed journals, and most importantly, to a teacher who served as a gatekeeper and navigator. This gatekeeper, whether a professor or a journal editor, ensured a minimum standard of quality, methodology, and context. You couldn't simply learn a complex subject. You had to undergo a process of apprenticeship. The internet eliminated that gatekeeper. This was its great liberating force. But the removal of the gatekeeper had unforeseen and catastrophic consequences. We collectively mistook access to information for understanding. This is the fundamental error. Reading a summary of an article on Wikipedia or watching a 3-minute YouTube video about relativity does not make you a physicist. It simply makes you someone who possesses surface-level data. The problem is that knowledge is not a collection of facts. It is a structure, a complex web of connections, context, caveats, and methodological constraints. An expert spends years not merely gathering facts, but building this structure in their mind. They know why a fact was established, what alternative theories existed, and how far that fact can be stretched under different conditions. The modern consumer wants the final product without undergoing the process that creates it. They obtain raw, undigested information stripped of context, and then try to squeeze it into their pre-existing worldview. This is what we call the death of context. When you read Study X found Y, without knowing who funded the research, what the sample size was, or what flaws were raised during peer review, you are operating with a fragment that is incredibly easy to manipulate. This has led to the illusion of expertise. Today, finding 3 links that support your argument is enough to feel properly equipped to debate someone with a PhD. This quick search provides just enough superficial knowledge to cross the threshold of feeling confident, but nowhere near enough to cross the threshold of true understanding. Furthermore, the internet has transformed knowledge into a reactive resource. We no longer seek information to explore a subject. We seek it to quickly reinforce our position in a debate or justify our emotions. We use knowledge as ammunition, not as a tool of inquiry. This distorts the very purpose of learning, turning it from a slow, humble pursuit of truth into a fast, aggressive act of self-affirmation. This shift from hierarchy to anarchy, from context to fragment, has created fertile ground for a psychological trap we all fall into. If all facts appear easily accessible, it becomes tempting to assume that the experts who spend years studying them are hiding something, or simply aren't as smart as we are, armed with a search bar. And this leads us to the very heart of the problem, the psychology of false confidence, which lies at the root of our epistemic anarchy. Behind the illusion of understanding created by the internet lies a deep, fundamental trap of human psychology. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. This phenomenon, named after the researchers who identified it, describes a cognitive bias in which people with low competence in a given field tend to vastly overestimate their abilities, and, most ironically, the less competent a person is, the higher their confidence tends to be. The internet is the perfect incubator for this effect. Fast access to shallow data allows us to instantly climb to the point psychologists call the peak of Mount Stupid. This is the moment when someone who has quickly picked up the terminology or skimmed 2 articles feels they have grasped the essence of an issue. At that moment, their confidence is at its maximum, while their real knowledge is at its minimum. Why? Because they lack metacognitive skills, the ability to think about their own thinking, that are required to recognize complexity and acknowledge the gaps in their knowledge. Incompetence robs a person of the very tools needed to perceive their own incompetence. This false confidence then fuels an anti-expert attitude. Acknowledging someone else's expertise means acknowledging one's own limits. It carries cognitive and emotional costs. It is far easier and far more comfortable to dismiss the expert as biased, elitist, or part of the system than to admit that understanding the problem requires years of effort we are unwilling to invest. We turn a question of fact into a question of morality. I represent truth and common sense, and you are part of the corrupt elite. In a culture that glorifies self-confidence and individualism, respect for competence is replaced by respect for one's own unearned opinion. If I can Google as well as you can, then why should your opinion be worth more than mine? This question is not a call for equality. It is the disguise of intellectual laziness. This psychological shift quickly transforms into epistemic tribalism, or cognitive tribal thinking. We no longer choose whom to trust based on qualifications, evidence, or methodology. We choose whom to trust based on group identity and their ability to confirm our worldview. Facts become ideological weapons. If a respected virologist or economist says something that contradicts my political beliefs, I don't examine their data. I immediately reject them as an enemy, and their scientific evidence as propaganda. Meanwhile, I blindly accept the opinion of an anonymous commenter who uses the same slogans and rhetoric as my tribe. We are not seeking truth. We are seeking confirmation of our identity. This process creates a closed loop. Social media platforms optimized for maximum engagement detect this pattern and amplify it, constantly feeding us content that reinforces our biases and fuels our outrage against the enemy, whether that enemy is experts or another tribe. In the end, we become so confident in our incompetence that we actively resist any learning that could knock us off the peak of stupid and send us into the valley of despair, the place where real learning begins, where a person realizes just how little they know. But descending into that valley requires courage, and our society rewards only the kind of confidence that contains no doubt. If personal psychology pushes us toward false confidence, then the systemic failures of institutions destroy the anchors of trust that could otherwise stop us. We cannot ignore the fact that over the past decades, many authoritative structures, universities, major media outlets, government agencies, and even scientific communities have given the public real reasons to doubt their objectivity. corruption, financial scandals, confirmed conflicts of interest, and, most importantly, slow responses to rapidly unfolding crises have eroded society's faith in them. And here is what happens. When institutions make mistakes, or worse, when they politicize facts, they create a vacuum. That vacuum is instantly filled by what appears to be more honest, more straightforward, and more real pseudo-expertise from the internet. To a disillusioned person, an anonymous speaker who reveals the truth and tells it like it is seems far more authentic than a Harvard professor speaking in complex, cautious language. This crisis is most visible in two critical areas. First, scientific consensus. Science is, by nature, slow, careful, and rooted in constant self-correction. It deals in probabilities, not absolute truths. But in moments of crisis, a pandemic, climate change, economic instability, society demands immediate, 100% certain answers. When scientists say, our data is preliminary, and we are still learning, the public perceives this nuance not as honesty, but as incompetence or deceit. And instantly, a pseudo-expert appears with a simple, digestible alternative theory that gives people what they crave most: the illusion of control. In the media space, simplicity always defeats complexity. Second, media and journalism. Traditional media, pressured by the digital economy, shifted from informing to optimizing engagement. A story that sparks outrage spreads far faster and generates far more revenue than a story requiring sober, nuanced analysis. As a result, media outlets don't just report conflict, they amplify it, platforming the most extreme voices to hold our attention. This creates the illusion that society is split 50-50 on everything. Even when scientific consensus is 99-1, it's crucial to understand that pseudo-experts succeed because they offer what institutions either fail to provide or refuse to provide. They offer comfort, simple explanations for complex, frightening problems, usually involving a single villain or a hidden conspiracy. Validation. They tell the listener that their intuitive, unexamined opinion is correct, that they are one of the few who see the truth. Identity. They turn ignorance into a virtue, offering the listener the role of a clear-sighted outsider against a blind, corrupt system. As a result, collective ignorance stops being just a lack of knowledge. It becomes a socially protected position, defended under the banners of free speech and free thought. By rejecting expertise, we do not become freer. We simply hand over our capacity for rational judgment to those most skilled at manipulating our fears and our hunger for validation. The collapse of institutional anchors has left us drifting in a sea of opinions, a sea in which our personal compass has already been broken by the Dunning-Kruger effect. We have traced how the democratization of information created the illusion of understanding, how our psychology pushes us toward false confidence, and how the systemic failures of institutions destroyed the anchors we once relied on. At the heart of our epistemic anarchy is not a lack of facts, but a lack of epistemic humility. Epistemic humility is not weakness, it is the highest form of intellectual strength. It does not mean you must believe everything you are told. On the contrary, it means being honest about your own limitations and respecting the process of knowledge itself. We have stopped respecting the labor behind competence. We want everything to be instantly accessible, easily digestible, and most importantly, affirming of our right to be right. The path forward requires a collective and individual act of rebellion against this ease. We must restore the discipline of thought. First, we must learn to evaluate information by looking beyond what is said and focusing instead on how it was discovered. Demand methodology. Seek primary sources. When you encounter a claim, ask yourself, what is this person's method? Who reviewed their work? What evidence are they ignoring? This process, tedious, unrewarded by likes, is our only defense against epistemic chaos. Next, we must cultivate tolerance for complexity. The most dangerous temptation offered by pseudo-experts is comfort. They explain complex, frightening global problems, economic inequality, pandemics, climate change, with one simple villain or one secret conspiracy. These simplified narratives offer a false sense of control. True expertise always comes with nuance, caveats, and the acknowledgement that reality is profoundly complicated. We must learn not to flee from this complexity, but to accept it as an essential component of mature, rational existence. And finally, we must make an emotional shift. Pseudo-experts offer us a powerful identity. They tell the listener that their intuitive, unverified opinion is correct, and that they are one of the few who see the truth. The role of the enlightened outsider standing against the blind system. This transforms ignorance into a virtue, but we must reject this cheap form of identity. We must accept that years of focused study and genuine expertise create a kind of value that cannot be replaced by 15 minutes of online searching. In an era where everyone can think of themselves as an expert, the most radical act is the conscious decision to remain a learner. This means returning to respectful silence in the presence of true competence, being willing to listen, and to accept that in most areas, we truly know nothing. Only through such humility can we descend from the peak of stupidity and begin the real, slow, fruitful path toward understanding. Our call is not a call for submission, but for intellectual integrity, to restore respect for the process rather than just the result. There is no simplicity on this path, no instant gratification, but there is something far more valuable, the ability to distinguish the grains of truth from the chaff of noise. Thank you for taking the time to reflect on this. Share in the comments, what field of knowledge have you consciously admitted is too complex for you, and how did that realization change the way you see the world?